The white walls of the psychiatric facility stretched endlessly before me, sterile and cold under the fluorescent lights that hummed their mechanical tune 24 hours a day. I pressed my face against the reinforced glass window of what they called the common room, watching families come and go in the parking lot below, wondering if anyone would ever come for me. 3 weeks had passed since my father signed those papers, since he looked me in the eye and said those words that still echoed in my mind like a broken record. "It's for your own good, Emma." My own good. The phrase tasted bitter in my mouth as I traced patterns on the glass with my fingertip, leaving small smudges that a nurse would soon wipe away with practiced efficiency. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Everything here was wiped away, sanitized, controlled. Just like my life had been systematically erased in a matter of hours on that terrible Tuesday morning when the police arrived at my apartment with a court order and my father standing behind them, his face a mask of manufactured concern. I had been Emma Katherine Phillips for 26 years, a kindergarten teacher with a small apartment in downtown Portland, a woman who paid her bills on time, who had never so much as received a speeding ticket, who spent her weekends visiting my 4-year-old daughter Lily at my ex-husband's house according to our custody agreement. I was ordinary in the most beautiful way possible, content with my quiet life of finger paints and story time, of bedtime calls with my little girl who would tell me about her day in that rapid-fire way that only children possess. But ordinary, I was learning, could be weaponized against you by people who understood how to manipulate the system. People like my father, Dr. Richard Phillips, whose reputation as a prominent psychiatrist in the community gave weight to his words when he claimed his daughter was suffering from a mental breakdown. People like my ex-husband Michael, who saw an opportunity to gain full custody of Lily and took it without hesitation. People like my stepmother Katherine, who had been quietly poisoning my father's perception of me for the past 3 years since she'd entered our lives with her perfect smile and her perfectly reasonable suggestions about how I should live my life. The memory of that morning played in my mind like a horror movie I couldn't turn off. I had been making coffee in my kitchen, still in my pajamas, when the knock came, not the gentle rap of a neighbor or the familiar rhythm of a friend, but the authoritative bang that could only mean trouble. Through the peephole, I saw 2 police officers and behind them, my father, dressed in his expensive navy suit, his silver hair perfectly styled even at 7 in the morning. "Emma Phillips," the taller officer asked when I opened the door, though he already knew the answer. My father had undoubtedly provided them with my photograph, my address, every detail they needed to execute whatever plan had been set in motion without my knowledge. "Yes, that's me," I replied, my voice still rough with sleep, confusion making my thoughts sluggish. "Is everything okay? Dad, what's going on?" My father stepped forward then, his face arranged in an expression of paternal concern that I would later recognize as carefully rehearsed. "Emma, sweetheart, we're here to help you. You haven't been yourself lately, and we're all very worried about you." The officers produced the paperwork then, official documents with seals and signatures that meant my freedom was about to disappear. A psychiatric hold, they explained, authorized by my father as my next of kin due to concerns about my mental state and my ability to care for myself. 72 hours of mandatory observation, they said, though those 72 hours would stretch into weeks through a series of legal maneuvers I didn't understand at the time. "I don't understand," I said, my hands shaking as I tried to process what was happening. "I'm fine, I'm perfectly fine. Dad, tell them I'm fine," but my father's expression never wavered, never showed a crack in his professional facade. "That's exactly what someone in your condition would say, Emma. The fact that you can't see how unwell you've become is precisely why this intervention is necessary." I thought of Lily then, sleeping peacefully in her bed across town, unaware that her world was about to change forever. "What about Lily? I'm supposed to pick her up for lunch today. It's Saturday, it's my day with her." "Michael will be taking care of Lily," my father said, and something in his tone made my blood run cold. "He's been very concerned about your recent behavior as well. This is all for the best, Emma. You'll see that when you're thinking more clearly." They gave me 15 minutes to pack a bag, while one of the officers watched me move through my apartment like a sleepwalker. I grabbed clothes without really seeing them, toiletries that wouldn't matter in a place where everything was regulated and monitored. I wanted to call my best friend Sarah, wanted to call my lawyer, wanted to call someone who could explain how my ordinary Saturday morning had turned into a nightmare, but they said there would be time for phone calls later, once I was settled and evaluated. The ride to Riverside Behavioral Health Center was silent, except for the police radio crackling with other people's emergencies. I sat in the back seat, separated from my father by a sheet of reinforced glass, and watched my neighborhood disappear behind us. The trees were just beginning to turn yellow and orange, autumn painting the city in warm colors that seemed to mock the coldness spreading through my chest. Riverside looked exactly like what it was, a place designed to contain people who had lost control of their lives. The building was modern but institutional, all clean lines and no character, surrounded by perfectly manicured lawns that no patient would ever be allowed to walk on alone. Security cameras perched on every corner like electronic vultures, recording every movement, every moment of despair that would unfold within these walls. The intake process was humiliating in its thoroughness. They took my clothes, my jewelry, my shoelaces, anything that could potentially be used for self-harm, they said, though I had never shown any inclination toward hurting myself. They gave me hospital scrubs in return, faded blue cotton that smelled of industrial detergent and other people's misery. They cataloged my belongings, like evidence in a crime scene, sealing them in clear plastic bags that would sit in a storage room gathering dust. Angela Morrison was the psychiatrist assigned to my case, a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a gentle manner that almost made me believe she genuinely wanted to help. But kindness, I was learning, could be just another tool in the system's arsenal, a way to make you compliant while your life was dismantled piece by piece. "Tell me about why you think you're here, Emma," she said, during our first session, her pen poised over a legal pad, as if my words were specimens to be examined under a microscope. "Because my father lied about my mental state to have me committed," I replied, trying to keep the anger out of my voice, because I had already learned that anger was interpreted as evidence of instability. "Because my ex-husband saw an opportunity to take my daughter away from me, and because no one bothered to ask me for my side of the story before deciding I was crazy." Morrison nodded thoughtfully, making notes that I couldn't read from my position in the uncomfortable plastic chair across from her desk. "Your father mentioned that you've been experiencing paranoid thoughts lately, feeling like people are conspiring against you. Can you tell me more about that?" The irony was suffocating. Here I was, the victim of an actual conspiracy, being told that my awareness of it was proof of my mental illness. "It's not paranoia when they're actually out to get you," I said, immediately regretting the cliché, but unable to think of a better way to express the truth of my situation. "Can you give me some specific examples of what you mean by that, doctor?" Morrison asked, her voice maintaining that carefully neutral tone that psychiatrists seem to learn in medical school. I thought about the past few months, about the subtle changes I had noticed, but dismissed as coincidence or imagination. Katherine's sudden interest in my custody arrangement with Michael, the way she would bring up my struggles during family dinners, painting me as overwhelmed and unstable when I felt perfectly capable of managing my life. The strange phone calls from people claiming to be from Lily's school, asking about my mental health history. Michael's newfound concern for my well-being, expressed through lawyers rather than direct conversation. "My stepmother has been undermining me for months," I began, then stopped myself. Even to my own ears, it sounded like the beginning of a paranoid delusion. "She asks leading questions about my personal life, then repeats my answers in ways that make me sound unstable. She's been in contact with my ex-husband behind my back, sharing information about my private conversations with my father." Dr. Morrison continued taking notes, her expression giving nothing away. "How do you know she's been in contact with Michael?" "Because he mentioned things in court that he could only have known from conversations I had with my father. Private conversations about my finances, my work stress, my dating life. Things I never shared with Michael directly." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And you believe your stepmother shared this information with him? I know she did, I said, frustration bleeding into my voice, despite my efforts to stay calm, but I understand how that sounds. I understand that from your perspective, I'm just another patient claiming that everyone is against them, but sometimes everyone really is against you, Dr. Morrison, sometimes the conspiracy is real. She set down her pen and looked at me directly, her kind eyes searching my face for something I couldn't identify. Emma, I want you to know that I'm here to help you, not to judge you, but I need you to understand that your father is genuinely concerned about your well-being. He provided some very specific examples of concerning behavior. My heart began to race, but I forced myself to remain still to appear calm and rational. What kind of examples? Dr. Morrison consulted her notes, flipping through several pages before finding what she was looking for. He mentioned that you've been calling him at all hours of the night, sometimes incoherent, talking about people following you. He said you've missed several days of work recently due to what you called surveillance of your apartment building. He's concerned that you've stopped taking care of yourself properly, that your apartment has become cluttered and unsanitary. Each accusation hit me like a physical blow because they were all complete fabrications, yet they sounded plausible enough to justify my being here. I had never called my father in the middle of the night. I had never missed work due to paranoid concerns. My apartment was small but clean, organized in the precise way that came naturally to someone who spent their days managing groups of 4-year-olds. None of that is true, I said quietly, but even as the words left my mouth, I realized how futile they were. It was my word against my father's, and he was Dr. Richard Phillips, respected psychiatrist and pillar of the community. I was just Emma, the unstable daughter who couldn't see how sick she had become. Your father also mentioned that Michael has expressed concerns about your fitness as a mother. Apparently Lily has come home from visits with you talking about the bad people who are watching your house. She's been having nightmares, bedwetting, regression behaviors that started after your visits. This lie was the cruelest of all because it involved my daughter, because it turned my love for her into evidence of my instability. Lily never said anything like that to me. She's been perfectly happy during our visits. We play games, we read stories, we go to the park. She's never mentioned bad people or seemed scared. Children often protect their parents from their own fears, Dr. Morrison said gently. They don't want to worry the adults they love, so they save their concerns for the parent they feel safest with. The logic was sound, the kind of psychological insight that would make sense to anyone who didn't know it was built on a foundation of lies. Michael was Lily's primary caregiver, the stable parent in their narrative, so of course she would feel safe expressing her fears to him. The fact that these fears didn't exist, that they had been fabricated to support a custody grab, was irrelevant to the professional sitting across from me. I spent the rest of that first session trying to defend myself against accusations I had never heard before, trying to prove negatives, trying to convince a stranger that I was exactly who I claimed to be, a normal woman who had been betrayed by the people closest to her. But the more I protested my sanity, the more convinced Dr. Morrison seemed to become that I was exactly as unstable as my father had claimed. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of group therapy sessions, medication evaluations, and supervised phone calls that were monitored and recorded. I called Sarah, my best friend since college, desperate to hear a familiar voice that might anchor me to the reality I was losing. Emma, honey, where are you? Sarah's voice was tight with worry when she finally answered my call on the third day. I went by your apartment, but the landlord said you'd moved out. Your school said you were taking a leave of absence for mental health reasons. Nobody would tell me anything else. The revelation that my life was being dismantled while I sat helpless in this sterile prison made my knees weak. I haven't moved out of my apartment, and I didn't request a leave of absence. Sarah, I need you to listen to me carefully. I'm at Riverside Behavioral Health Center. My father had me committed 3 days ago, and I think he's trying to take custody of Lily away from me. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that I wondered if the call had been disconnected. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was careful, measured in a way that told me she had already been influenced by whatever story was being told about my mental state. Emma, your dad called me yesterday. He's really worried about you. He said you've been having some kind of breakdown, that you've been saying people are plotting against you. Because they are plotting against me, I said, then immediately regretted the outburst because I knew how it sounded. Sarah, you've known me for 8 years. Have I ever shown signs of mental illness? Have I ever been paranoid or delusional or anything other than completely ordinary? No, she admitted slowly, but your dad said that sometimes these things come on suddenly, especially when people are under stress. And you have been under a lot of stress lately with the divorce finalization and the custody stuff. She was right about the stress, but wrong about everything else. The divorce had been finalized 6 months ago, and the custody arrangement had been working smoothly until this nightmare began. But I could hear in her voice that doubt had already been planted, that the narrative of my mental breakdown was taking root even in the mind of my closest friend. I need you to do something for me, I said, lowering my voice because I knew the call was being recorded. I need you to go to my apartment and document everything. Take pictures, make notes about the condition of the place. My father told them it was cluttered and unsanitary, but you know that's not true. Emma, I don't think I should get involved in family medical issues, Sarah said, and I could hear her pulling away from me, creating distance to protect herself from whatever instability I was supposed to represent. Please, I whispered, hating the desperation in my voice but unable to hide it. Just look at my apartment, just see for yourself that I'm not crazy. After I hung up, I sat in the common room staring at the phone as if it might ring with better news, with someone who believed me, with some evidence that the world I had known still existed outside these walls. But the phone remained silent, and I was left alone with the growing certainty that my father's plan was working exactly as he had intended. The other patients at Riverside were a mix of people genuinely struggling with mental illness and others like me, who seemed to have been deposited there by circumstances beyond their control. There was Margaret, a woman in her 70s whose adult children had convinced a judge she was too confused to live alone, though she seemed perfectly lucid during our conversations. There was James, a veteran dealing with PTSD who had been committed after a neighbor reported him for suspicious behavior that sounded to me like nothing more than hypervigilance in response to trauma. But there were also people who clearly needed help, people whose delusions and hallucinations were genuine, people whose behavior was unpredictable and sometimes frightening. The staff seemed to treat us all the same, as if the circumstances that brought us here were irrelevant once we passed through those locked doors. We were all patients now, all people whose judgment couldn't be trusted, all cases to be managed rather than individuals to be heard. I tried to be a model patient, to prove through my behavior that I didn't belong there. I attended every group session, participated in art therapy, took the medications they prescribed without complaint, even though they made me feel foggy and disconnected from myself. I thought that compliance would demonstrate my stability, that cooperation would fast-track my release. Instead, it seemed to confirm their diagnosis of someone who was responding well to treatment, someone who had needed this intervention all along. The worst part was the visits from my father, who came every few days with Katherine by his side, both of them wearing expressions of concerned love that felt like mockery. They would sit across from me in the visiting room, speaking in the gentle tones reserved for the mentally fragile, asking how I was feeling and whether I was beginning to understand why this was necessary. The important thing is that you're getting the help you need, Katherine would say, reaching across the table to pat my hand with fingers that felt cold even through her expensive gloves. We're all so proud of you for accepting treatment instead of fighting it. But I was fighting it, just not in ways they could see. During the long hours when I wasn't in therapy or groups, I was planning, thinking, trying to figure out how to prove my sanity to people who had already decided I was insane. I was remembering conversations, analyzing interactions, looking for the patterns that had led to this moment. I was building a case in my mind even though I had no access to a lawyer, no way to present evidence, no platform from which to defend myself. The breakthrough came during my second week at Riverside, during a conversation with Margaret that started innocently enough, but revealed something that changed everything I thought I knew about my situation. We were sitting in the common room after dinner, watching the news on the television that was always tuned to channels that couldn't upset anyone, when Margaret mentioned something that made my blood run cold. My daughter-in-law works for a law firm that specializes in family court cases, she said casually, working on a crossword puzzle as she spoke. She's the one who helped my children get the guardianship papers. Very efficient, she said. They have a whole system for these kinds of situations. What kind of situations? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral even though my heart was racing. Oh, you know, when family members need to be protected from themselves, or when there are custody disputes that need to be resolved quickly. She said they work with psychiatrists and social workers to document concerning behaviors, build cases for interventions. It's become quite common, apparently. Margaret's words confirmed what I had started to suspect but hadn't wanted to believe, that my commitment wasn't the result of genuine concern for my well-being, but part of a coordinated legal strategy designed to strengthen Michael's position in any future custody battle. By having me declared mentally unstable by a respected psychiatrist, by creating a paper trail of psychiatric treatment and medication compliance, they were building an ironclad case for why Lily would be better off with her father full-time. Did your daughter-in-law mention the name of the law firm? I asked, trying to sound merely curious rather than desperate for information. Hartwell and Associates, Margaret replied without looking up from her puzzle. Very expensive but very effective according to her. They specialize in what they call proactive family protection. Sounds so much nicer than what it really is, doesn't it? That night, lying in my narrow hospital bed listening to the sounds of a psychiatric facility after dark, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done being a victim, done allowing other people to control my narrative, done accepting that my word meant nothing against their professional credentials and legal maneuvering. If they wanted to play games with my life, I would learn the rules and beat them at their own game. But first I needed to get out of Riverside, and that meant convincing Dr. Morrison that I was stable enough for release. It meant performing sanity rather than simply being sane, meant playing the role of a grateful patient who had come to understand that her concerned family had been right all along. It meant swallowing my anger and my pride and my desperate need to scream the truth, because the truth had become irrelevant in this carefully constructed fiction of my mental illness. The next morning, I requested a private session with Dr. Morrison and began the performance that I hoped would save my life and my relationship with my daughter. I told her that I had been doing a lot of thinking about the concerns my family had raised, that I was beginning to see how my behavior might have appeared concerning to people who loved me. I admitted that I had been under more stress than I realized, that I might have been more paranoid and suspicious than the situation warranted. I think I understand now why my father felt he had to take action, I said, hating every word but forcing them out with what I hoped looked like genuine insight. I wasn't seeing clearly how my stress was affecting my judgment, how it might have been affecting Lily. I'm grateful that he cared enough to get me help before things got worse. Dr. Morrison smiled, the first genuine warmth I had seen from her since my arrival. That's exactly the kind of self-awareness we hope to see in our patients, Emma. It takes courage to acknowledge when we need help, and even more courage to accept it. Over the following days, I continued to play the role of the recovering patient, participating enthusiastically in group therapy, expressing gratitude for the medications that were helping me think more clearly, asking thoughtful questions about coping strategies and stress management. I watched other patients and learned from their mistakes, saw how resistance was interpreted as lack of insight, how questioning the diagnosis was evidence of continued delusion. I also learned about the legal realities of my situation from a patient advocate who visited the facility weekly. She explained that psychiatric holds could be extended indefinitely if the treating physician believed the patient remained a danger to themselves or others, that my father's status as next of kin gave him significant input into my treatment decisions, that challenging my commitment would require legal representation that I couldn't access while I remained institutionalized. The system is designed to err on the side of caution, she explained during one of our brief conversations. It's easier to keep someone in treatment longer than necessary than to release them too early and face liability if something goes wrong. The catch-22 was perfectly designed. I couldn't prove my sanity while locked in a psychiatric facility, but I couldn't challenge my commitment without first being released. My only option was to convince my treatment team that I was ready for discharge, which meant accepting their diagnosis and playing the part of the grateful, compliant patient who had learned to recognize her own illness. 3 weeks after my admission, Dr. Morrison finally suggested that I might be ready for a step down in my level of care. Not full discharge, but transfer to an outpatient program that would allow me to return home while continuing therapy and medication management. It wasn't freedom, but it was progress, a crack in the wall of my imprisonment that I might be able to widen with time and careful planning. "I'm very pleased with how you've responded to treatment," she said during our final inpatient session. "Your willingness to acknowledge your symptoms and engage with therapy has been remarkable. I think you're ready to take the next step in your recovery." I nodded gratefully, maintaining the facade of the grateful patient even as I planned my next moves. Once I was out of Riverside, I would have access to legal representation, to my own medical records, to the evidence I needed to prove that my commitment had been based on lies. I would find a way to expose the conspiracy that had stolen my freedom and threatened my relationship with my daughter. But as I signed the discharge papers and gathered my belongings from the storage room, I realized that the real battle was just beginning. They had played their first move brilliantly, using the system's built-in biases against anyone labeled as mentally ill to their advantage. Now it was my turn to move, and I intended to make it count. The taxi ride back to my apartment felt surreal, like returning to a life that belonged to someone else. The leaves had fully turned during my absence, painting the city in shades of red and gold that seemed almost aggressive in their beauty after weeks of institutional beige. Everything looked the same but felt different, as if my 3 weeks of captivity had shifted the fundamental nature of the world around me. My building's hallways echoed with familiar sounds of ordinary life: televisions playing, children laughing, someone practicing piano. Normal sounds from a normal world that I was no longer sure I belonged to. When I reached my door, I found it exactly as I had left it, my keys still working, my belongings undisturbed despite my father's claims about my deteriorating living conditions. I walked through my small apartment, documenting everything with my phone camera, creating evidence of my stability that should have existed 3 weeks ago. The kitchen was clean, dishes washed and put away. The living room was tidy, books arranged on shelves, photographs of Lily displayed on every surface. My bedroom was organized, bed made, clothes hung in the closet with the precision of someone who had spent years managing classroom supplies and teaching children about order and responsibility. There was nothing here that suggested mental illness or inability to care for myself. Nothing that justified my father's dramatic intervention or the weeks I had lost to institutional captivity. But I understood now that truth was less important than perception, that the game being played against me operated by different rules than the ones I had always believed governed civilized society. I made myself coffee in my own kitchen, sat at my own table, and began to plan my counterattack. First, I needed a lawyer, someone who specialized in family law and understood the tactics being used against me. Second, I needed to rebuild my relationship with Lily, to prove that I was the same loving mother I had always been despite the narrative being constructed around my supposed mental breakdown. Third, I needed to investigate the connections between my father, Katherine, Michael, and whatever legal team was orchestrating this campaign against me. But most importantly, I needed to remember who I was before this nightmare began, to hold on to the truth of my own experience even when everyone around me insisted it was a delusion. I was Katherine Phillips, kindergarten teacher, loving mother, ordinary woman who had been extraordinary enough to threaten people who thought they could erase her from her own life. They had made one crucial mistake in their careful planning: they had underestimated me. They saw a woman isolated from support systems, overwhelmed by legal proceedings, vulnerable to manipulation by authority figures. They didn't see the teacher who had spent years advocating for children who couldn't advocate for themselves, who understood how to document abuse and navigate bureaucratic systems, who knew that the most important battles were often fought with patience and precision rather than force. As I sat in my apartment that first night home, surrounded by evidence of my own stability and sanity, I made a promise to myself and to Lily, even though she couldn't hear it. I would not disappear quietly. I would not accept the role of the unstable mother who had been saved from herself by concerned family members. I would fight for my daughter, for my freedom, for the truth that everyone seemed so eager to bury. The war for my life had begun in earnest, and I intended to win it. The law office of Patricia Chen sat on the 15th floor of a glass tower downtown, its waiting room decorated with muted blues and grays that suggested competence without ostentation. I had chosen Patricia from a list of family law attorneys after spending hours reading online reviews and case histories, looking for someone who specialized in fathers' rights cases gone wrong and mothers fighting against institutional bias. Her website mentioned experience with psychiatric commitment challenges and custody disputes involving mental health allegations, which made her exactly what I needed. Patricia herself was younger than I had expected, probably in her early 40s, with sharp black hair cut in a precise bob and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of my appearance as I entered her office. She wore a charcoal suit that spoke of success without flash, and when she shook my hand, her grip was firm enough to suggest confidence in dealing with difficult cases. "Miss Phillips," she said, gesturing to a leather chair across from her desk. "I've reviewed the preliminary information you provided over the phone. This is quite a complex situation you're facing." I had spent the entire weekend preparing for this meeting, organizing documents and timelines, creating a narrative that would make sense to someone hearing it for the first time. The challenge was presenting my case without sounding like the paranoid patient my father had painted me to be, balancing urgency with rationality, desperation with determination. "I understand how it must sound," I began, settling into the chair and placing my folder of documents on the desk between us. "A woman claiming that her father and ex-husband conspired to have her wrongfully committed. But I have evidence that this was a coordinated effort to strengthen Michael's position in any future custody modification." Patricia leaned back in her chair, her expression neutral but attentive. "Tell me about your relationship with your daughter before the commitment. How was the custody arrangement working?" "Perfectly," I said, then caught myself. "I mean as well as any divorce custody situation can work. Lily stayed with Michael during the week because his house is in the same school district, and I had her every weekend plus Wednesday evenings. She was happy, well-adjusted, doing great in preschool. There were never any problems with our visits, never any concerning behaviors or regression issues like they're claiming now. And your ex-husband never expressed concerns about your parenting before this." I thought carefully about the question, trying to remember any signs I might have missed, any conversations that should have warned me what was coming. Michael and I had our issues, obviously, or we wouldn't have divorced, but he never questioned my parenting. If anything, he used to compliment how good I was with Lily, how much she loved our time together. He would joke that she always came home, talking about the fun activities we'd done together. Patricia made notes on a legal pad, her pen moving quickly across the page. "What changed? When did you first notice that something was different?" Looking back, I think it started about 6 months ago, around the time Katherine really began inserting herself into my relationship with my father. She would ask questions during family dinners that seemed innocent but were actually quite loaded. Things like whether I was feeling overwhelmed with work and single parenting, whether I thought Lily might benefit from more stability in her primary residence, whether I had considered therapy to help with the stress of the divorce. "And you think she was gathering information to use against you?" "I know she was, because Michael started bringing up things in conversations that he could only have learned from my father. Private details about my finances, my dating life, my work situation. Things I had mentioned to my dad in confidence during our weekly phone calls." Patricia set down her pen and looked at me directly. "Emma, I need to ask you this, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you ever struggled with mental health issues? Depression, anxiety, anything that could give credibility to their claims?" The question was fair but painful, because it highlighted how my normal human responses to stress had been weaponized against me. "I went through a rough patch after my divorce, which I think is completely normal. I saw a therapist for a few months to help process the end of my marriage and adjust to single parenting. But I was never diagnosed with any mental illness, never prescribed psychiatric medication, never displayed any concerning behaviors." "Do you have records from that therapy?" "Yes, and I've already contacted Dr. Sarah Brennan to request copies." She was surprised when I told her what had happened, said my father's claims were completely inconsistent with everything she observed during our sessions. Patricia made another note, then pulled out a different folder from her desk drawer. "I want to show you something that might explain what you're dealing with. This is a case I handled 2 years ago, very similar circumstances. A mother who was committed by family members right before a custody hearing, held just long enough to create a paper trail of mental health treatment that was used against her in court. She slid several documents across the desk, legal briefs and psychiatric evaluations that painted a picture of a woman whose life had been systematically dismantled by people who claimed to love her. The pattern is always the same: isolate the target, document supposed concerning behaviors, get professional backing for an intervention, then use the psychiatric hold as evidence that the person is unfit for custody. My hands shook slightly as I read through the case file, seeing my own nightmare reflected in another woman's experience. What happened to her? Did she get her children back? Eventually, but it took 2 years and cost her over $100,000 in legal fees. The damage to her relationship with her children was significant. That's why timing is so crucial in these cases. The longer the separation continues, the more the children adapt to their new normal, and the harder it becomes to argue for a change in custody. The weight of what I was facing settled on my shoulders like a physical burden. 2 years of fighting, a fortune in legal costs, the possibility that Lily might grow used to not having me in her daily life. But the alternative was surrender, accepting the narrative that had been constructed around my supposed mental illness, and watching my daughter disappear from my life, one supervised visit at a time. "What's our first step?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded despite the turmoil in my chest. "We need to document everything that happened before, during and after your commitment. I want a detailed timeline of events, copies of all medical records from Riverside, and a comprehensive list of anyone who might be willing to testify about your mental state and parenting abilities before this began." Patricia opened her laptop and began typing notes as she spoke. "We also need to investigate the connections between your father, your ex-husband, and whatever legal team is representing Michael. If this was coordinated, there will be a paper trail. Phone records, emails, financial transactions, these conspiracies leave footprints if you know where to look." Over the next hour, we mapped out a strategy that felt both overwhelming and hopeful. Patricia would file an emergency motion challenging the circumstances of my commitment and requesting immediate restoration of my parenting time with Lily. Simultaneously, we would begin building a case for fraud and conspiracy, gathering evidence that my psychiatric hold had been based on fabricated claims, rather than genuine mental health concerns. "I have to warn you," Patricia said as our meeting wound down, "this is going to get ugly before it gets better. They've invested too much in this narrative to let it go quietly. Expect them to double down, to manufacture more evidence of your instability, to try to make you react in ways that support their claims." I thought about the controlled environment of Riverside, how every emotion had been pathologized, every protest interpreted as evidence of denial and lack of insight. How do I prove I'm sane when sanity itself becomes suspicious? By being methodical, strategic, and unshakable in your commitment to the truth. Document everything, stay calm under pressure, and trust that evidence will eventually matter more than narrative. Patricia stood and extended her hand again. "This won't be easy, Emma, but I've seen cases like this one before. The key is patience and precision." Leaving Patricia's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced since that terrible morning when the police arrived at my door. Not the desperate hope of a drowning person grasping for any floating debris, but the solid hope of someone who finally understood the game being played and had found an ally who knew how to play it. My next stop was Lily's preschool, where I hoped to gather evidence about my parenting and my daughter's well-being during our visits before the commitment. Sunshine Academy was a small private school housed in a converted Victorian mansion, with bright classrooms and a playground that always echoed with children's laughter. I had chosen it carefully when Lily started there 2 years ago, researching their philosophy and meeting with teachers to ensure it would be the right environment for her. Mrs. Rodriguez, Lily's teacher, greeted me with warmth but also a hint of awkward uncertainty that told me she had heard some version of recent events. "Emma, how are you? We've missed seeing you at pickup. Lily's father mentioned you were dealing with some health issues." "I'm much better now," I said, keeping my voice light and positive. "I was hoping we could talk about Lily, about how she's been doing lately. I know there have been some concerns raised about her behavior after our visits, and I wanted to get your perspective as her teacher." Mrs. Rodriguez's expression shifted to something more professional, more guarded. "Of course, why don't we step into the conference room where we can talk privately?" The conference room was tiny, barely large enough for a small table and 2 chairs. but it offered privacy from the curious ears of other parents and staff members. Mrs. Rodriguez closed the door carefully before taking her seat across from me. "Lily is such a bright, sweet child," she began, and I could hear the diplomatic tone that suggested she was choosing her words carefully. "She's always been one of our most well-adjusted students. Very social, creative, eager to learn. Has that changed recently?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Well, her father did mention some concerns about regression behaviors at home. Bedwetting, nightmares, anxiety about separation. But honestly, Emma, I haven't seen any of that here at school. If anything, Lily seems happier and more confident than ever. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by anger that Michael had fabricated problems that didn't exist even in Lily's school environment. What about her behavior on Mondays after our weekend visits? Any signs of distress or unusual behavior? Mrs. Rodriguez looked genuinely puzzled. Mondays? No, quite the opposite actually. Lily always comes in on Mondays full of stories about her weekend with Mommy. She lights up talking about your adventures together. Last Monday she spent half of morning circle time telling the class about the butterfly garden you visited together. But there hadn't been a Monday after our weekend visit in over a month. The last time I had seen Lily was 3 days before my commitment, during our Wednesday evening dinner at her favorite pizza place. Mrs. Rodriguez was remembering older conversations from before my world had been turned upside down. "When was the last time you actually saw me pick up Lily?" I asked carefully. "Oh, it's been a while now. Your ex-husband said you were dealing with health issues and wouldn't be doing pickups for a while. But like I said, she always talked so fondly about your time together." The revelation that Michael had been lying to Lily's school about why I was absent hit me like a physical blow. He had created a narrative of voluntary absence due to health issues, making it seem like I had chosen to step back from active parenting rather than having been forcibly removed from my daughter's life. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I need to tell you something important. I wasn't absent by choice. I was hospitalized, and I haven't seen Lily in over 3 weeks. If she's been telling stories about recent weekend visits, they're either memories from before my hospitalization or perhaps wishful thinking." The teacher's face went pale as she processed what I was telling her. "Oh my God, Emma, I had no idea. Her father never mentioned hospitalization, just said you were dealing with stress and needed some time to focus on your health. I'm going to be fighting to restore my parenting time with Lily, and I may need character witnesses who can speak to my relationship with her and my fitness as a parent. Would you be willing to provide a statement about what you've observed?" Mrs. Rodriguez nodded immediately. "Of course, Lily adores you, and you've always been such an involved, caring parent. I'll document everything I can remember about your interactions and her behavior patterns." My next stop was more difficult, a visit to my father's house to confront the people who had orchestrated my 3-week disappearance from my own life. I knew it was risky, that they might interpret any show of anger or emotion as evidence of continued instability, but I needed to look them in the eye and let them know that I wasn't going to disappear quietly. The house where I had grown up sat on a tree-lined street in the suburbs, a colonial-style home with a perfect lawn and flower beds that Katherine maintained with obsessive precision. My father had lived there for 30 years, first with my mother until her death from cancer 5 years ago, and now with Katherine, who had redecorated everything to suit her own tastes while erasing almost every trace of my mother's presence. I rang the doorbell instead of using my key, a symbolic acknowledgement that this was no longer my home, that I was now a visitor in the place where I had spent my childhood. Katherine answered, looking perfectly put together as always, her blonde hair styled in a way that suggested a recent salon visit and her makeup applied with the precision of someone who never allowed herself to be seen as anything less than immaculate. "Emma," she said, her voice carrying just the right note of concerned surprise. "What a lovely surprise. How are you feeling, dear? Your father and I have been so worried about you." "I'm much better, thank you," I replied, forcing myself to smile despite the fury burning in my chest. "I was hoping to speak with both of you about Lily, about working together to make sure she's okay during this difficult time." Katherine's expression flickered for just a moment, a micro-expression of calculation before her mask of concern slipped back into place. Of course, dear. Your father is in his study. Why don't you come in? The interior of the house felt foreign despite its familiarity. Every room redecorated in Katherine's preferred style of modern minimalism that erased the warmth and lived-in comfort my mother had created. Family photographs had been replaced with abstract art. My mother's collection of books and knickknacks had disappeared, and even the furniture had been swapped out for pieces that looked expensive but uninviting. My father emerged from his study as we entered the living room, looking older than I remembered but still commanding in his bearing. He had always been a tall man, but now he seemed somehow diminished, whether by age or by the weight of what he had done to his own daughter. "Emma," he said, and I searched his voice for any trace of genuine warmth or regret, but found only the professional tone he used with difficult patience. "You look well. I'm glad to see that the treatment was helpful." "The treatment was unnecessary," I said quietly, keeping my voice level despite the emotional storm raging inside me. "But I'm not here to debate that. I'm here because I want to understand why you felt it was necessary to separate me from my granddaughter during what you claimed was a mental health crisis." Katherine settled gracefully onto the sofa, patting the cushion beside her in invitation, but I remained standing. I needed the psychological advantage of height, needed to feel like I had some control in this confrontation even if it was only symbolic. "Emma, sweetheart," my father began, settling into his favorite armchair with the kind of deliberate movement that suggested he had prepared for this conversation. "Everything we did was motivated by love and concern for both you and Lily. You weren't thinking clearly, you were making concerning statements, and Michael was genuinely worried about Lily's safety and emotional well-being." "What concerning statements?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would be more fabrications. "You called me several times in the middle of the night, talking about people following you, about conspiracies to take Lily away from you. You missed work repeatedly, claiming that surveillance teams were watching your building. Your apartment had become cluttered and unsanitary." Each lie was delivered with the smooth confidence of someone who had practiced this narrative until it felt true even to him. But I had documentation now. Phone records that would show I had never called him in the middle of the night, work attendance records that would prove I had never missed school except for legitimate sick days, photographs of my apartment that contradicted his claims about my living conditions. "Dad," I said, and for the first time in this conversation, I let some of my real emotions show through. "I'm your daughter. You've known me for 26 years. Have I ever in my entire life shown any signs of mental illness? Have I ever been paranoid or delusional or unable to care for myself?" For just a moment, something shifted in his expression, a flicker of uncertainty or perhaps guilt. But Katherine's hand found his arm, a subtle gesture of support and reminder, and his professional mask slipped back into place. "Mental illness can manifest suddenly, especially under stress," he said, falling back on psychiatric textbook language rather than speaking to me as his daughter. "The fact that you had never shown symptoms before doesn't mean they weren't developing. Early intervention was crucial. And Michael's concerns about Lily, what specifically did he tell you that made you think she was in danger?" This time it was Katherine who answered, her voice honey-sweet with manufactured concern. "Lily had been having nightmares after visits with you, bedwetting again after months of being fully potty-trained. She would come home talking about bad people watching your house, clearly picking up on your paranoid thoughts and being traumatized by them." I thought about my conversation with Mrs. Rodriguez, about Lily's teacher who had seen no signs of regression or trauma, who described a child who came to school happy and excited after our visits together. The lies were so elaborate, so detailed, that they would be convincing to anyone who didn't have access to independent verification. "I'd like to see Lily," I said, changing tactics. "If you're both so concerned about her well-being, surely supervised visits would be appropriate while I continue my recovery." "That's really Michael's decision to make," my father replied. "As her primary custodial parent, he has the right to determine what's in her best interest. He has shared custody, not sole custody," I corrected. "And I have legal rights as her mother that don't disappear because of a psychiatric hold." Katherine's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, dear, but you have to understand that everyone's primary concern is Lily's well-being. If she's been traumatized by recent events, it might be better to give her some time to stabilize before reintroducing potentially stressful visits." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, a careful dance of accusations and denials, concern and deflection. They had their story, and they were sticking to it, presenting a united front of loving family members who had reluctantly taken action to protect a mentally ill daughter and her vulnerable child. Every question I asked was met with psychiatric jargon and expressions of hurt that I couldn't see how much they cared about me. When I finally left their house, I felt drained but also clearer about what I was facing. They weren't going to admit to any wrongdoing, weren't going to show any cracks in their narrative that I could exploit. This would have to be won with evidence and legal strategy rather than appeals to family loyalty or conscience. My phone rang as I was driving home, Patricia's name appearing on the screen. I pulled over to take the call, hoping for good news but prepared for another setback. "Emma, I've filed the emergency motion for restoration of parenting time," she said without preamble. "The court has scheduled a hearing for next Friday. That's the good news. The bad news is that Michael's attorney has filed a counter motion requesting sole custody based on your recent psychiatric hospitalization." My heart sank, but I forced myself to focus on the practical implications rather than the emotional impact. What does that mean for our strategy? It means we're not just fighting to restore your original custody arrangement. We're fighting to prevent them from taking Lily away from you permanently. The stakes just got much higher. That evening, I sat in my apartment surrounded by documents and timelines, building the case that might save my relationship with my daughter. Phone records, medical records, witness statements, photographs, anything that could prove my side of the story and expose the lies that had been told about me. But as I worked, a darker thought crept into my mind. If they were willing to have me committed on fabricated charges, if they were prepared to lie to teachers and courts and family members to get what they wanted, how far would they go to protect their investment in this narrative? What would they do if they realized I was building a case that could expose not just their deception but potentially their criminal liability for false imprisonment and fraud? I double-checked the locks on my apartment door and made sure my phone was fully charged. If they had underestimated me once, I wasn't going to give them the opportunity to do it again. The battle for my daughter was just beginning, and I intended to be ready for whatever came next. The following days passed in a blur of preparation and investigation. Patricia had hired a private investigator named Marcus Webb, a former police detective who specialized in family court cases involving fraud and deception. His first breakthrough came when he discovered that Michael had consulted with Hartwell and Associates, the same law firm Margaret had mentioned at Riverside, 6 months before my commitment. This wasn't a spontaneous response to concerning behavior, Marcus explained during our meeting at Patricia's office. This was a long-term strategy that required months of planning and coordination. We're looking at a conspiracy that goes much deeper than we initially realized. The evidence was starting to pile up, creating a picture of calculated deception that went far beyond family conflict into potentially criminal territory. But I knew that evidence would only matter if I could survive the immediate threat to my custody rights and the ongoing attempts to paint me as an unfit mother. As Friday's hearing approached, I prepared myself for the fight of my life, knowing that everything I valued most hung in the balance. They had made one crucial mistake in their careful planning. They had given me a reason to fight that was stronger than any fear they could manufacture. They had threatened my relationship with my daughter, and that was a line I would never allow them to cross without consequences. The courthouse steps felt like a battlefield as I climbed them Friday morning, Patricia beside me carrying the briefcase that contained months of evidence and preparation. The building loomed above us, its marble columns and bronze doors suggesting the weight of justice that would be decided within its walls. I had dressed carefully for this moment, choosing a conservative navy suit that projected competence and stability, my hair pulled back in a style that said responsible mother rather than unstable patient. Michael was already inside with his legal team when we arrived, flanked by 2 attorneys from Hartwell and Associates who looked expensive and confident. He avoided eye contact as we passed in the hallway, but I caught a glimpse of something that might have been guilt or nervousness in his expression before he turned away. My father and Katherine sat in the gallery behind Michael's table, presenting a united front of concerned family members supporting the responsible parent. Judge Sarah Martinez presided over Family Court Division 3, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She had a reputation for being thorough and fair, according to Patricia, but also for having little patience with parents who put their own interests ahead of their children's well-being. As she reviewed the case files before beginning, I wondered which category she would place me in. This is an emergency hearing regarding custody modification in the matter of Lily Katherine Blake, Judge Martinez announced. Mr. Blake is seeking sole custody based on concerns about the child's mother's mental health and fitness for parenting. Ms. Phillips is requesting restoration of her original parenting time and challenging the circumstances that led to the temporary suspension of her custodial rights. Michael's attorney, James Hartwell himself, rose to present their case with the polished confidence of someone who had orchestrated this scenario from the beginning. He painted a picture of a devoted father forced to protect his child from an increasingly unstable mother, using my psychiatric commitment as the centerpiece of his argument. Your Honor, Miss Phillips was involuntarily committed to a psychiatric facility just 6 weeks ago after displaying concerning behaviors that directly impacted the minor child's safety and emotional well-being, he began, his voice carrying the authority of undisputed fact. The child exhibited regression behaviors following visits with her mother, including bedwetting, nightmares, and anxiety about imaginary threats that clearly originated from exposure to her mother's paranoid delusions. He presented medical records from Riverside, testimony from my father about my supposed deteriorating condition, and statements from Michael about Lily's behavioral changes. Each piece of evidence had been carefully curated to support their narrative, creating what appeared to be an overwhelming case for protecting a child from a mentally unstable parent. When Patricia rose to cross-examine, she began with a question that cut to the heart of their deception. Mr. Blake, when exactly did you first contact Hartwell and Associates about modifying your custody arrangement? Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair before answering, I'm not sure of the exact date, sometime after I became concerned about Emma's behavior. According to phone records subpoenaed by this court, you first contacted this law firm on March 15, 6 months before Miss Phillips' psychiatric commitment. Can you explain why you were seeking legal advice about custody modification 6 months before these alleged concerning behaviors began? The courtroom fell silent as the implications sank in. Michael's face flushed red as he struggled to formulate an answer that wouldn't incriminate him further. I may have made some preliminary inquiries about my options, he said finally. That doesn't mean I was planning anything. Patricia moved to her next exhibit, a series of phone records showing extensive communication between Michael, my father, and Katherine in the weeks leading up to my commitment. These records show 47 phone calls between you and Dr. Phillips in the month before Miss Phillips was hospitalized. What were you discussing so frequently? We were concerned about Emma's well-being, Michael replied, but his voice lacked conviction, concerned enough to coordinate your stories about her alleged symptoms. Concerned enough to manufacture evidence of behavioral problems that her daughter's teacher says never existed. Hartwell objected, but the damage was already done. The pattern of coordination was becoming clear to everyone in the courtroom, including Judge Martinez, whose expression had grown increasingly skeptical as the questioning continued. Patricia's most devastating moment came when she called Mrs. Rodriguez to testify about Lily's actual behavior and my relationship with my daughter. The teacher's testimony directly contradicted every claim Michael had made about regression and trauma. In my professional opinion, Lily Phillips Blake is a well-adjusted, happy child who has always spoken fondly of both her parents. Mrs. Rodriguez testified. I have never observed any signs of trauma, regression, or concerning behavior following her visits with her mother. If anything, she seemed to look forward to those visits and would return to school excited to share stories about their time together. When confronted with this contradiction, Michael claimed that Lily's behavioral problems only manifested at home, conveniently in the only environment where there were no independent witnesses to verify or dispute his claims. The turning point came when Patricia presented the evidence Marcus had uncovered about the conspiracy. Bank records showing payments from my father to Hartwell and Associates. Email communications between Katherine and Michael discussing the Emma problem and ensuring Lily's stability. Most damning of all, a recording Marcus had obtained of a phone conversation between Katherine and Michael in which they discussed the timeline for triggering the intervention. We need to make sure everything is documented properly before we move forward. Katherine's voice said from the courtroom speakers. Richard has the medical authority to make the commitment stick, but we need Michael to have examples ready about Lily's behavior. Make sure you mention the bedwetting and the nightmares. Those always resonate with family court judges. The courtroom erupted in whispers as the implications of the recording became clear. This wasn't a family responding to a mental health crisis. This was a calculated conspiracy to remove me from my daughter's life using fabricated evidence and professional manipulation. Judge Martinez called for order, her expression grim as she processed what she had heard. Mr. Blake, are you prepared to explain this recording to the court? Michael's composure finally cracked completely. It's not what it sounds like, he stammered. We were just trying to make sure Lily was protected. Emma really was acting strange, saying things that didn't make sense. What things specifically? Patricia asked. She kept talking about people plotting against her, about conspiracies to take Lily away from her. Michael's voice grew desperate as he realized how his words sounded in light of the evidence that an actual conspiracy had been orchestrated against me. So when Miss Phillips expressed concern that people were plotting to take her daughter away from her, she was actually demonstrating accurate perception of reality rather than paranoid delusion. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael couldn't answer without admitting that my supposed delusions had been accurate assessments of the situation, which would undermine the entire foundation of their case. When it was my turn to testify, I spoke directly to Judge Martinez about my love for Lily and my commitment to being the best mother I could be. I acknowledged the stress I had been under, but emphasized that stress was a normal response to the coordinated campaign being waged against my parental rights. Your Honor, I was never mentally ill. I was being systematically undermined by people who thought they could manipulate the system to achieve their goals. They used my father's professional reputation and the inherent bias against anyone labeled as mentally unstable to separate me from my daughter. But mental health stigma should not be weaponized to destroy families, and fabricated psychiatric emergencies should not be allowed to override parental rights. The most emotional moment came when Patricia played a recording I had made for Lily during my time at Riverside, a bedtime story I had narrated on one of the patient phones in hopes that someone would deliver it to her. My voice, tired but filled with love, told the story of a brave little princess who was temporarily separated from her mother, but never stopped believing they would be together again. I love you to the moon and back, sweet girl, my recorded voice said to the silent courtroom. Mommy will always find her way back to you, no matter what anyone tells you. You are my greatest treasure, and nothing will ever change that. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom, including Judge Martinez, who had to pause for a moment before continuing with the proceedings. When Dr. Morrison from Riverside was called to testify about my psychiatric treatment, Patricia's cross-examination revealed the problematic foundation of my original commitment. Under questioning, Dr. Morrison admitted that she had relied primarily on my father's assessment of my condition and had no independent verification of the concerning behaviors he had reported. Did you ever speak to Miss Phillips' employer about missed work days? Patricia asked. No, I relied on the family's reports. Did you personally observe Miss Phillips' living conditions? No, that information came from her father. Did you speak to any independent witnesses about her behavior or parenting? No, the family members who brought her in were considered reliable sources. The systematic deconstruction of the case against me continued throughout the day, with each witness either recanting their previous statements under oath, or being revealed as having no first-hand knowledge of the behaviors they had reported. By the time closing arguments began, it was clear that the conspiracy had been exposed and the fabricated evidence demolished. Patricia's closing argument was passionate and precise, tying together all the evidence of deception, while emphasizing the harm that had been done to both me and Lily through this orchestrated separation. Your Honor, this case represents everything that is wrong with a system that allows professional credentials and family connections to override basic parental rights. Miss Phillips was not mentally ill. She was inconvenient to people who wanted to reshape her family according to their own preferences. They used psychiatric commitment as a weapon, exploiting the stigma and fear surrounding mental health to achieve their goals. She gestured toward the stack of evidence on her table. The phone records, the financial transactions, the recorded conversations, all of it proves that this was a premeditated conspiracy to deprive a loving mother of her relationship with her child. Miss Phillips deserves not only the restoration of her parental rights, but also justice for the fraud and false imprisonment she has endured. Hartwell's closing argument was a desperate attempt to salvage a case that had collapsed under scrutiny. He tried to argue that regardless of the methods used, genuine concerns about my mental health had motivated everyone's actions, that the conspiracy allegations were themselves evidence of paranoid thinking. But Judge Martinez had heard enough. Her decision was swift and unambiguous. The court finds that the evidence presented demonstrates a systematic effort to manufacture grounds for psychiatric commitment and custody modification through fraud and deception, she announced. The temporary suspension of Miss Phillips' parental rights was based on fabricated evidence and is hereby immediately terminated. She looked directly at Michael and my father as she continued. Furthermore, this court is referring this matter to the district attorney's office for investigation of potential criminal charges, including conspiracy, fraud, and false imprisonment. The manipulation of psychiatric emergency procedures to achieve custody goals represents a serious abuse of both legal and medical systems. The judge's final orders restored my full custody rights, mandated makeup time with Lily to compensate for our forced separation, and awarded temporary full custody to me while Michael's fitness as a parent was evaluated in light of his participation in the conspiracy. As the gavel fell, I felt a complex mix of relief, vindication, and exhaustion. Justice had been served, but the cost had been enormous. Weeks of separation from Lily, thousands of dollars in legal fees, the destruction of my relationship with my father, and the knowledge that people I had trusted had been willing to destroy my life for their own purposes. Michael approached me as we were leaving the courtroom, his face pale and defeated. "Emma, I want you to know that I never meant for it to go this far. I just thought maybe Lily would be better off with more stability, and when your father suggested that you might need help." I looked at him for a long moment, this man I had once loved enough to marry, the father of my child who had been willing to traumatize our daughter through forced separation to achieve his goals. "You participated in having me falsely imprisoned, Michael. You lied to our daughter about where I was and why I couldn't see her. There's no coming back from that." He nodded, understanding that our co-parenting relationship would never be the same, that trust once broken on this scale could never be fully repaired. The reunion with Lily took place 3 days later in a neutral location, supervised by a family therapist to help her process the confusion and fear she had experienced during our separation. When she saw me, she ran into my arms with the kind of desperate joy that broke my heart while simultaneously healing it. "Mommy, where were you?" she asked, her small face pressed against my neck. "Daddy said you were sick, but I missed you so much." "I missed you too, sweetheart," I whispered, holding her tight enough to convince myself that this was real, that we were really together again. "But I'm better now, and we're going to be together so much more from now on." The criminal investigation that followed resulted in charges against my father, Katherine, and Michael for conspiracy and fraud. My father lost his medical license and faced potential prison time. Katherine's involvement earned her charges of accessory to fraud. Michael pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges in exchange for a reduced sentence and supervised visitation rights with Lily. 6 months later, I stood in my new apartment watching Lily play in her bedroom, surrounded by toys and books and all the evidence of a normal childhood that had been temporarily threatened but ultimately preserved. The legal battles were over, justice had been served, and my daughter was safely home where she belonged. The experience changed me in ways I was still discovering. I had learned that ordinary people could become capable of extraordinary deception when their interests were threatened. I had learned that the systems designed to protect families could be manipulated to destroy them. But I had also learned that truth has a power that ultimately overcomes even the most elaborate lies, that love creates a strength that can survive any trial. Patricia had helped me establish a foundation that provided legal assistance to parents who had been wrongfully separated from their children through psychiatric manipulation or false accusations. Too many families were destroyed by people who understood how to weaponize mental health stigma, and I was determined that my experience would help others avoid the same fate. As I tucked Lily into bed that night, she looked up at me with the serious expression she wore when processing important thoughts. "Mommy, are the bad people going to try to take you away again?" No, sweetheart, I said, smoothing her hair away from her face. The bad people can't hurt us anymore. And even if they tried, I would fight to come back to you every single time. She smiled then, the worry leaving her face as she settled into sleep. I know you would, Mommy, you're the bravest person in the whole world. Looking down at my daughter's peaceful face, I realized that she was right. I had become brave not through choice but through necessity, strong not because I wanted to be but because the alternative was losing everything that mattered. They had tried to erase me from my own life, but they had underestimated the power of a mother's love and the strength that comes from fighting for what is right. The locks had been changed, but I had found another way in. The doors had been slammed, but I had opened them again. They had called me crazy for seeing the conspiracy against me, but in the end, my clarity had exposed their lies and brought them to justice. Some battles are worth fighting no matter the cost, and some love is strong enough to overcome any obstacle placed in its path. I had learned both lessons the hard way, but I had learned them completely, and that knowledge would protect us both for the rest of our lives. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.